The nation of Syria today, as we're speaking at this moment, is at risk of becoming sitting US President Donald Trump's first outright major foreign policy failure. And to some extent, when we look at the tension between the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, and keep in mind, both are US partners and recently broke out into open fight in Aleppo. We've been talking about the nation of Syria, especially we talk about the chaos in the Middle East. And keep in mind, for 2026, it's not just about the war in Ukraine. It's not about what Donald Trump desires from the Greenland, and also about Syria. At this moment, we know the country's people are so glad the Assad regime is gone, but they are looking for something better, and hopefully by the end of 2026, and their wish will be granted. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Jamsheed Choksy. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me back, Will.
Well, Professor Choksy, let's talk about the nation of Syria. I do want to get started with the first question. There's no doubt that the country's people are so excited and finally received the news that the Assad regime is gone. And they are looking for and they're hopeful about the future. Now, at this moment, from your perspective, how do we describe the Syrian situation today? And also, will the people in Syria finally find what they're hoping for? Your thoughts?
And indeed, Will, Syria has come a long way from the civil war that ousted the Assad regime. It is, of course, very interesting that the new regime's leader begins as an Islamic State commander, then overthrows Assad. And we have this individual, al-Shara, who now we see him nicely covered in a suit in all the capitals. But ahead of our discussion today, I sort of ran through a list of where he's been. He's met with President Donald Trump 3 times. In Saudi Arabia, at the United Nations, and finally at the White House. He has been to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He has been to Russia twice, where he's met Putin. He's been to France. He's been to Brazil, Azerbaijan. He's visited the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. He's been all over the Middle East, almost every country except for Iraq and Iran. So he is someone who, for everything we can see, everything he says, indicates that he has put his terrorist past behind. In fact, the United States has removed sanctions that were specifically on him as a terrorist leader. And he seems to want to integrate with the world community. He's also met several times with Chinese delegations, the Chinese ambassador. He's welcoming Western and Eastern investment into Syria. So we've seen this in some sense, a massive transformation. So things are very hopeful. The question is, will it continue to stabilize? Will there be internal divisions? You briefly mentioned those. Will there be external challenges? That's what remains to be seen. And I think we can go on to talk about some of those challenges that are going to face al-Shara, because those are going to be the same challenges that are going to face President Trump and the United States, that are going to face China if China wants to get more deeply involved in economically bolstering Syria. And those are going to, shall we say, the predatory opportunities awaiting Iran and Russia.
Professor Choksy, based on the survey happened in 2025, again, domestically speaking, 50% of the Syrian citizens believe that corruption currently plagues the national state, agencies, and also institutions. But 70% see it as less widespread than it was under Assad. Professor Choksy, it's not the first time, and also I promise you, it won't be the last time that we talk about corruption, especially political corruption. And we have seen, and also we have heard, that the people live under the Assad regime, they were brutally treated. I mean, the images was just horrifying to watch. So from your perspective at this moment, number one, how do we define the word corruption at this moment? Is it just about political corruption, or there seems to be a strong connection between politics and finance? And also, how do we proceed that if the corruption were to stop, what does that say about the leadership? And also, what about say about the state of Syria? Your thoughts?
Syria under the Assad regime was essentially a family operational business. It was the Assad family regarded Syria, shall we say, as an extraction country for its personal wealth. It was a narco state. The drug trade, it was a drug called Captagon that was often manufactured in Iran and Iraq. Syria was the distribution point into Lebanon, into Israel, into Saudi Arabia. The Assad family and the small ethno-religious group around him, the Alavis, flourished very well while everyone else suffered. And they suffered not just through the direct corruption, but also the indirect corruption. That is a corruption that hinders development networks, that hinders aid. So we should keep in mind that in the decade before the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, there was a drought, a very deadly drought, for which foreign aid, which when it arrived, was siphoned off. So there are multiple levels of this corruption. As you pointed out, the corruption that was around 90% or perhaps greater has dropped to around 50%. So the hope is that it will continue to drop down to very low levels. Now, for that to happen, there will have to be national unity. There will have to be some degree of additional degrees of political stability. There will have to be international guidance. Because keep in mind that there was almost no civil bureaucracy under the Assads that was not corrupted by the Assads. So now we are having to see the entire sort of state apparatus having to be rebuilt to serve the people and not to serve the rulers.
Professor Choksy, let's bring Donald Trump into our conversation. Again, as you mentioned before, the current leader actually paid a short visit to the White House. Again, that was pretty stunning to the whole world, especially we look at the foreign policy. But meanwhile, as I mentioned in the intro, the tension between the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, both are U.S. partners, and they are completely not on the same page, and also create additional chaos in Aleppo. What role do you see for the U.S. at this moment? Because again, some believe that if U.S. doesn't solve the issue, Syrians will pay a heavy price. So in other words, the citizens, they cannot bear additional chaos on top of all that. So what role do you see the Trump play or the Trump administration play at this moment? And is that going to completely, I don't want to use the word solved, but at least minimize the threat from the domestic perspective? Your thoughts?
And the Kurdish issue, of course, extends beyond Syria. Kurdish nationalism is present in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran. What perhaps is in favor of Syria and the new transitional government there is that the Kurdish factions are divided. They're divided within Syria, they're divided within Turkey, they're divided within Iraq. As you know, Iraq has a Kurdish autonomous area in the north. But even there, essentially, it is not one autonomous area, but several autonomous areas divided between Kurdish factions. Iran has a Kurdish sectarian and secessionist problem in the northwest. But again, the rebel groups of Kurds tend to be factionalized. So what happened when the US and other countries were working to bring about the downfall of Assad was that they were able to work with the Kurds as well. Now, however, we can see that Donald Trump is pushing the Syrian transitional government and the Kurds to reach an agreement to put aside the hostilities. And in part, it has been working, but the agreements have broken down. We've seen that when the agreements have broken down, the Syrian government forces have moved into Kurdish areas. And what they've been doing is they've been immediately granting the Kurds Syrian citizenship. So they are trying to incorporate those areas into Syria, into the Syrian nation state. And my hunch is that eventually President Donald Trump's patience will run out, and he will give the Kurds of Syria an ultimatum to become part of the nation state of Syria. That, of course, is conditional on al-Sharaa continuing to play ball with the global community and not go rogue as his beginnings once were.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, you know the saying that if you pray for the rain, and you have to learn to deal with the mud. I mean, again, I think this is perfectly fit into what we talk about, that Trump administration's desire to play the role in the nation of Syria. I mean, again, we're not looking at the repetition of Venezuela for Syria, but at this moment, the Syrian government is expecting U.S. to play the role, or at least to have voice, to minimize the threat or to reduce the tension. Let's talk about another country, which is Israel. I mean, again, you mentioned it briefly. Just look at what's happening right now. Experts believe the recent clash in Aleppo, it's what they called a stalled negotiations. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, what is the delayed negotiation? And also, why is that even matter to the nation of Israel? I mean, again, since Donald Trump took office during the first term, and also we're looking at the second term, the relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump seemed to be closer and closer. Now, when we talk about Syria, what role does Israel play? And also, what does that mean? Again, going back to the first question, this delayed negotiation. Please unwrap that a little bit.
So what has been happening recently is that Syria and Israel have been working towards a security deal. Let us keep in mind that before the Syrian civil war broke out, the Golan Heights and the Syrian-Israeli border was a very quiet place, controlled by the Israelis, controlled by Assad's forces. No one wanted any problems. With the civil war, we saw the uprising, not just against Assad, but also that was the opportunity for Islamist terrorists to move into the region. Now, with Donald Trump, shall we say, as the godfather of the deal, we are having Israel and the al-Sharaa regime in Syria working towards a security agreement. That security agreement is intended to further stabilize Syria and to keep Iran out, to keep Russia out, but most of all, to keep Islamist terrorists, ISIS, out. Because as the problems with the Kurds resume between Syria and the Kurds, the great danger is that the Islamic State, ISIS, will move back in. And there are indications already that ISIS soldiers are recouping and regrouping in Syria. So one can see how the Syrian government and Israel would be moving together to quash that, while at the same time the Syrian government is trying to either militarily defeat the Kurds or place the Kurds in a military weak position so the Kurds have to negotiate. What we should be hopeful for is that agreement is reached between the Kurds and Syria, where the Kurds have some degree of political autonomy but are part of the Syrian state. At the same time that security agreements are reached that help stabilize Syria, because right now, Syria is far from out of crisis. I think we should spend maybe a few minutes talking about the domestic issues in Syria, which, if they are not resolved very quickly, will create yet another humanitarian crisis. And that, of course, will then destabilize the security situation.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, I was gonna get to that. So let's spend a few minutes to talk about the domestic issues in Syria. I mean, again, I'm looking at a report, and the number shows rather strong. Again, it's based on a survey. It's what they called the honeymoon period. You know, the survey was done back in 2025, and it shows the confidence level among the Syrians in selected national institutions. Number one is the president, and then we get to national government, army, courts, and legal system. But from your perspective, Professor Choksy, what are some of the major concerns in the nation of Syria that we need to pay attention despite this positivity or this hope among the citizens? And again, we know this country has gone through so much, let's be honest. Under the Assad regime, again, Assad was removed in 2024, but before that, it was just unimaginably painful for people to watch. So from your perspective, let's talk a little step by step. What are the issues that still need to be addressed in the nation of Syria, and how can we get from point A to point B? Your thoughts?
And that is perhaps that is the greatest challenge for Syria, because unless those issues are solved, terrorism will return, destability will return, the drug trade will return, all the negative aspects will return. What are the problems? Right now, thanks to the civil war and the Assad period, about 90% of Syria's population is living below the poverty line. So essentially what we're looking at is food, shelter, work, healthcare, those sort of basic issues. We're looking at somewhere between 5 to 9 million internally displaced people. Because of the civil war, their homes have been destroyed, their towns have been destroyed, they have been relocated. We are looking at the issue that for the majority of the population, consistent, steady work, employment is still hard to find. In Syria, like most third world countries, the state is the largest employer. And that employment was sort of doled out by the Assad regime to its supporters. Now the challenge is, how does one overcome? So the major problem then for the government, and let us say for the international community, is to help jumpstart the Syrian economy so that housing, food, medicine, healthcare, all those aspects fall back into place to create the nation state. And it's interesting, what we've seen is the Gulf Arab states getting involved in investing. The United States has gotten involved. China has gotten involved. Russia is, in a sense, on its way out. But at the same time, what Russia really is focusing on is trying to negotiate military bases, to retain some of its military bases, particularly on the Mediterranean, so that it has a Mediterranean presence. Unfortunately, Russia does not seem to be interested in economic assistance. So, and Iran, of course, right now is not capable of providing economic assistance. It is attempting to destabilize through the Assad elements left behind the state. So it's what we see as a great opportunity for Europe, for East Asia, for North America to be involved in rebuilding Syria. Because even geographically, as you look at Syria, it's right there in the middle. It's that connection point to Turkey, to the Mediterranean, to the Persian Gulf, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Israel. So its stability is extremely important.
Well, Professor Choksy, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. We talk about the domestic concerns in Syria. Let's talk about what we called friends and foes for the Syrian government. Again, you mentioned so many countries, the US and Turkey and Israel. But right now, I do want to focus on the nation of Iran. You and I, we just had a brief conversation about Iran. So today, let's pull Iran back into our picture or to our conversation when we address Syria. What is at stake for Syria at this moment? Because I know, again, you know, that it's better to make friends in a smarter way or not in a wrong way, especially for Donald Trump. And recently, Donald Trump has been very vocal about, taking out the Iranian government if we continue to see the protests and the riots on the street. We don't know whether the words are going to be put into behind actions. But again, those rhetorics should sound very alarming. So from your perspective, your final thoughts, what do we know about Syria and Iran at this moment? And should the Syrian government be careful or even be mindful when they are dealing with Iran? Your final thoughts.
The Assad regime was supported and maintained by Iran and by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Iran was caught off guard when the Assad regime was toppled. Iran lost a major regional ally. It lost a conduit that permitted it to arm Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, etc. So Iran is trying very hard to regain its positions in Syria. It's trying to do so through the remnants of the Assad regime. It's also trying to do so by sowing discord between the Syrian government, Kurds, and other groups. It is extremely important for the Syrian government to keep Iran out. At least, shall we say, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, if Trump succeeds in bringing about regime change in Iran, then that'll be a different conversation. But as for right now, Iran is not a friend of a stable Syria, because an unstable Syria is to Iran's benefit. So it is interesting when we think about all these countries that the new leader of Syria has visited. Iran is not among them. And I think that sends a very important point. He's even been to Russia. And let's keep in mind, Assad is in exile in Russia. But while reaching out and having to reach out to Russia, because Russia is still a superpower, he has avoided any contact with Iran. And so the question that we can look forward to discussing in the future is, will the new Syrian government be able to reach some kind of agreement, some kind of balance with the Islamic Republic of Iran if the Islamic Republic continues? And if it does so, can it do so in a way that stabilizes the region rather than letting Iran return into Syria to destabilize Syria and the region? Once again, Syria is in the center there. It is important to the Saudis, to the Iranians, Turks, all the regional players. And what's most important is that Syria, shall we say, is for Syrians rather than for the outsiders.
Of course, again, Professor Choksy, Syria will continue to generate noises in the Middle East. And again, as we look at Donald Trump's desire in Greenland and also the domestic chaos, I'm sure that his administration, it's not going to forget, or it's hard to forget the presence of Syria. So as I mentioned in the intro, people in Syria are looking for changes and they are being hopeful. And hopefully that they are able to find what they want and the country will eventually to be better. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Choksy. Again, Dr. Jamsheed Choksy, it's a professor of Central Eurasian Studies at the Indiana University in Bloomington. I strongly encourage everyone go online to connect with Professor Choksy. Again, Professor Choksy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention or even closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much
Thank you
for
very
doing
much.
this.